Well, hello. My name is Dan, I'm an animator, and this is New Frame Plus, a series about video game animation. Of all of the long-running franchises in gaming, as an animator, there's no series that I find quite as fascinating as Final Fantasy. It's one of the only AAA franchises I can think of that's been releasing new entries consistently for this long and has, for almost that entire history, been primarily focused on story and characters. And that narrative focus makes character animation uniquely important to Final Fantasy's history, because animation plays a crucial role in defining character. It tells us how that character moves, how they act, how they feel. It's animation that brings these characters to life. So if you were wanting to, say, study the ways character animation has evolved across video game history, I propose that there are few franchises better suited to that examination than Final Fantasy. In this new series of videos, starting today, I want to look at how the animation in this franchise has evolved, both technically and artistically, from its 8-bit origins to its modern subtleties and spectacle. I want to go back to the beginning and look at each of these entries one by one to see how Square's character animation and story presentation techniques have developed over time as gaming technology improves and gives them increasingly powerful tools. I want to draw a detailed line showing how we get from 16x16 sprites with strict color limitations to modern, high-fidelity animation systems. From expressionless, faceless combat units to living, breathing characters. I want to look at how we got from this to this. So let's get started. Welcome to the animation of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy was released in Japan in 1987 and appeared in North America 2.5 years later. And to really understand the animation in this relatively primitive game, we're going to need to understand some basics about the 8-bit hardware it was built to run on. Let's talk about the graphical capabilities and limitations of the Nintendo Entertainment System. To start, the image that an NES could render and output to your TV was 256 pixels wide and 240 pixels tall. For reference, this video's resolution is 1920 by 1080 pixels, so the NES rendered an image this big. It's very cute, I know. And when rendering that adorable little image, the NES offered a palette of 54-ish usable colors, but there were some pretty rigid limitations on how many of those colors could be used at once. For pixel art, the NES gave you 2 layers to work with, a background layer and a sprite layer. The background layer could use a total of 13 colors at one time, and it was composed of a bunch of tiles all aligned in a grid, which could be scrolled in any direction you like. The sprite layer worked differently though. Sprite tiles could move freely around the screen, independently of each other, making them perfect for representing characters, enemies, projectiles, and obstacles. These sprite tiles were generally 8x8 pixels in size, but you could build larger characters by using multiple tiles. So, for example, Small Mario here is assembled using 4 tiles, making him 16x16. Mega Man was made out of 10 tiles. And then you've got Punch-Out opponents who are built of just so many tiles, they're very large. But these 8x8 sprite tiles also had to be used sparingly, because poor little NES here could only handle 64 of them on screen at one time. Plus, the sprite layer could only use 12 colors at once, and no more than 3 colors per 8x8 tile. Also, you couldn't have more than 8 sprites occupying the same horizontal scan line at once without some of them disappearing or flickering. Now, what I have just given you is a somewhat very oversimplified explanation of how NES graphics worked, but it should be enough for our purposes here. You get the basic idea of what this little nostalgia brick was capable of. That said, if you find the topic of retro console graphics interesting, I highly recommend checking out Retro Game Mechanics Explained. Alex is far more qualified than I am to discuss this topic, and his videos are fantastic. And also, thank you, Alex, for proofreading the script. I appreciate it. Anyway, now that we have gotten a better understanding of the Nintendo Entertainment System's limitations, it's not too hard to guess at how Final Fantasy's graphics are constructed. In the overworld view, the world geography lives on that scrollable background layer, and your player character runs around on top, on the sprite layer. Same thing in towns and dungeon screens. The environment is on the background layer, and the background tiles are also temporarily used for rendering dialogue boxes when you talk to somebody. Then on the sprite layer, you've got the player character, NPCs, and whatever else is running around on top of that environment. Then we've got the battle screen, where the black background, the windows that frame everything, that little strip of scenery up top, the text, and even the enemies all live on the background layer. Then on the sprite layer, you've got the party members, the selection cursor, weapons, and battle effects, like these little hit explosions. It's kind of amazing when you step back and look at what these game devs managed to create within such strict limitations. Ooh, speaking of which, many of these world graphics and character animations you are looking at right now were created by Kazuko Shibuya. She did tons of the character sprite design and animation work for the first 6 games in this series, and it wasn't until recently that she started getting the recognition she deserves for that. She basically laid the foundation that all Final Fantasy animation is built on, and her name deserves to be recognized right up there alongside Sakaguchi, Amano, and Uematsu. But with all of that context now established, let's talk animation. As you can probably see, Final Fantasy I's animation is pretty sparse. There is just not a whole lot of it, but that's kind of what makes it interesting. So this here is the Fighter, one of your 6 playable characters. As a pixel art sprite, Fighter can be animated in 2 distinct ways. The sprite can be moved around the screen, like so, and this sprite can be swapped for a different sprite of the same character in a different pose. These swappable sprites are essentially different drawings of the character, different frames of animation, a collection of poses that this character can do. And if we were to, say, rhythmically swap between these 2 frames and translate the character across the screen, well, there you go. We've got ourselves a walk. There are 6 such playable characters in Final Fantasy I, and I use the word characters very loosely. There's Fighter, Thief, Black Belt, Red Mage, Black Mage, and White Mage. You get to choose 4 of these in whatever configuration you like to form your adventuring party. Now, the more frames of animation these little sprite characters have, the more actions they can be shown doing. But because we're dealing with the technical and production limitations of the 8-bit console era, each of these characters has precious few frames of animation available to them. I'm assuming budget was the main limitation here. By all accounts, it sounds like the higher-ups at Squaresoft didn't have a ton of faith in this project at the time, but by my count, our 6 main characters here each have 12 frames of sprite animation total. Just 12 different poses to cover everything they might do in the entire game. That's not very many. But that strict limitation kind of makes things interesting because with so few poses to work with, where do you choose to spend them? What sorts of actions do you create custom frames of animation for? Where will you get the most bang for your buck? This decision says everything about what the game's creators prioritized, so let's see what we got here. On the world map, each character class has a handful of 16 by 16 sprites dedicated to walking. 2 alternating poses for walking down, 2 poses for walking up, and 2 poses for walking to the side, which can be flipped. That is 6 poses spent already. We are already halfway through the entire pose library for our main characters in this JRPG, and all we've done is walk around. The rest of that pose budget is spent on the battle screen. Here, the characters are rendered at a slightly taller 16 by 24 size for greater detail. And there are so few poses here, let's just go down the list. Each class has a neutral standing pose for when they are not actively doing anything. They also have a walking pose with their feet splayed out, which can be cycled with the standing pose to create a crude walking animation whenever the characters need to step forward or backward. They also have an attack pose, which cycles with the walking pose when the character raises and swings their weapon. The weapon itself is a separate sprite, which allows them to change the look of the weapon depending on what the character has equipped. There is a spellcasting pose for when the character uses magic, and again, the spell effects are added as a separate sprite. And, by the way, this spellcasting pose can be cycled with the standing pose to double as a victory animation. Then we have a weakened or injured pose for when the character is at low health, and we have a dead pose for when they get KO'd. And that's it. That is the full extent of your main character's animation in this video game. Now, I should mention that each of these characters do get a new set of buffed up Crystal Warrior sprites later in the game when their classes get upgraded, but it's really just the same poses with a fresh look. A class swap, basically. So, what can we tell from looking at this pose set? What sorts of actions does this pose library cover? Well, we've got 6 poses for navigating around the world, and we've got 6 poses for combat. So this entire pose library is dedicated to showing functional gameplay information. This character's walking, this one's attacking, this one's hurt, and this character's knocked out. And every one of these poses is pretty easy to read at a glance. Even at 16 by 24 pixels, you can tell that this character is walking, this one looks hurt, and this one's super dead. Which is good. You need that functional gameplay clarity, and it can be hard to achieve in an 8-bit game. But I think the more interesting question is, what sorts of actions does this pose library not cover? What are there no poses for? To me, the most noticeably absent thing is acting. There are no sprites designed specifically for emotional expression of any kind, which for a Final Fantasy game is pretty unusual, right? The closest thing we have to an emote is the victory pose, celebrating a successful battle, and really that one's just the spellcasting animation being repurposed in a clever way. Now, I don't blame the dev team for choosing to spend their limited art resources where they did here. When it comes to 8-bit graphics, honestly, prioritizing those functional basics is probably the right call. I just find it fascinating that in this, the first game of what is going to become a very character-driven JRPG series, your cast of main characters has zero ability to express personality or emotion. And what's more, the few poses these characters do have are pretty lacking in personality. I do realize it is extremely unfair to demand distinct characterization from the sprites in an 8-bit game. They are 24 pixels tall and 3 colors each. Give them a break. But still, there's hardly any noticeable variation or contrast in the posing from class to class. There are some slight differences, obviously. The black belt being knocked out does look subtly different from how the black mage looks knocked out, and the fighter's spellcasting pose does look different from the white mage's spellcasting pose, but still, that variety is very constrained, and it doesn't really tell us anything more about these characters. They do each have a unique visual design, which is good, but that only serves to distinguish their combat function. Honestly, I should stop calling them characters because they're not really. They've got 0 individual personality traits, and not one of them's even gonna speak a single line of dialogue at any point in the adventure. This is simply your custom squad of combat units, and they exist to smack goblins, and to grow stronger so they can smack larger goblins. And that is a perfectly fine way to build a collection of classes for your 8-bit RPG combat system. Not super helpful when it's time to tell a story, though. But then I suppose what little story exists in Final Fantasy doesn't demand much expression from this cast. Compared to what this series would later become, Final Fantasy I is narratively light. There is a story in here, of course, and a pretty ambitious one considering, about a fantasy world in decay, and a time-traveling villain's quest for immortality, and 4 light warriors fighting to restore these elemental orbs in order to return balance to their crumbling world. But at least in the original NES version of the game, ignoring the remakes, that story's presence in the actual play is incredibly sparse. There's the opening text crawl, and you'll get some plot details blurted out by a handful of NPCs as you explore all the world's towns. Then at the end, you get a small exposition dump from a wizard circle, a brief villain monologue, and then a pretty lengthy outro screen that's desperately trying to explain all of the plot that just happened. It's like 15 minutes of story spread across dozens of hours of bullying ogres for their lunch money. When you step back and look at Final Fantasy I's character and story presentation, it's almost hard to see it as the origin point for what this series became. You've got this blank slate cast of party members with no ability to speak or even emote, silently marching from one random battle to the next. You've got a bare bones and yet also somehow overly complicated plot delivered mostly through dialogue with static NPCs who also can't emote or say more than a single text box worth of words, lightly sprinkled across dozens of hours of grinding the same set of monsters over and over and over to level your blank slate of a party high enough to progress to the next grind. In terms of story and character, it doesn't even remotely engage to the degree that later games in the series would. But for all that it might lack on a narrative level, Final Fantasy I did succeed in creating a functional foundation. The format for this series' combat and traversal animation systems is now established, and the sequels to this game would build on that foundation quickly. And when I say quickly, I mean faster than you might think. But that's a story for next time. If you have enjoyed this and you want to be sure not to miss the rest of my retrospective series on Final Fantasy's animation, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the little bell next to it. Or consider supporting the show, like all of these wonderful people who've helped to make these videos better and better. When we come back next time, we're talking Final Fantasy II. I'll see you then.